Imagine driving home, minding your own business when flashing red and blue lights appear behind you. You stop, but instead of a routine check, you face condescending questions and unjust suspicion. Would you stay silent or demand answers? Samira Johnson, a decorated veteran, experienced just that, but her response changed everything. What happens when someone refuses to accept discrimination? Can one person shift the balance of power? As we break down this intense encounter, ask yourself, what would you do? Watch closely, because this story isn't just about one woman, it's about justice for all. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos, because the truth deserves to be told. Let's begin. The sun had barely begun to set, casting a soft amber hue over the quiet suburban streets. Samira Johnson, a woman in her early 40s, drove her sedan slowly down a tree-lined road, her mind occupied with the day's events. She had just finished a long meeting with a nonprofit organization where she worked as an advisor, and she was looking forward to getting home. The peace and quiet of the neighborhood were a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of her professional life. It was one of those evenings that felt serene, almost too perfect for an ordinary drive home. But this drive was far from ordinary. As she neared an intersection, Samira noticed a police car parked on the side of the road, its lights flashing faintly. It wasn't a usual sight in this peaceful neighborhood, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Samira didn't give it a second thought. She was just about to pass the car when suddenly the sirens blared, cutting through the tranquility of the evening. Her heart skipped a beat. "Great," she muttered under her breath, her hand instinctively gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. She pulled her car over to the side of the road, ensuring that she was well out of the way of passing traffic. Her mind raced for a moment as she tried to think of any reason why she might have been pulled over. She had not been speeding or breaking any laws. Samira was no stranger to encounters with law enforcement, especially given her background as a military officer. But she had never been in a situation like this before. The police officer stepped out of his car with purpose, his uniform crisp and his stride confident. He was a tall man, likely in his mid-30s, with short, neatly combed brown hair and a stern expression. His badge glinted in the dim light as he approached her car. Samira had experienced enough interactions with police officers to know that this one seemed different. There was something in his posture, a sense of authority that came off as overbearing, as though he expected to encounter trouble even in the most mundane of situations. The officer's face remained unreadable as he approached the driver's side of Samira's vehicle. Samira rolled down the window slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "Evening, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" The officer's voice was direct, almost too direct. It carried a certain sharpness, an edge that felt unnecessarily harsh. His eyes narrowed as if searching for a hint of guilt in her face. Samira exhaled quietly, her gaze unwavering as she met the officer's eyes. "No, I don't," she responded calmly, her voice composed, revealing nothing of her inner thoughts. Her military training had taught her to remain calm in the face of tense situations, but she could tell right away that this officer wasn't just performing a routine stop. "Well, you were driving a bit too fast back there," he said, his tone suspicious. "I clocked you at 40 in a 30-mile zone." "You know the speed limit, don't you?" Samira raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing together in a thin line. She knew the speed limit well, and she was certain that she hadn't been speeding. Still, she didn't flinch. Instead, she gave him a steady look and asked, "Is that the only reason you pulled me over, officer?" The officer's eyes flickered for a brief moment, as though he hadn't expected such a response. He stood there, arms crossed, studying Samira with a calculated gaze. "Why don't you step out of the car, ma'am?" he said suddenly, his voice carrying an unspoken command. Why? Samira asked coolly, not moving an inch. She had learned to question authority when necessary, especially when it didn't seem justified. Is there a specific reason why you need me to step out of my car? The officer's demeanor shifted slightly, but he didn't relent. I just want to make sure everything is in order. Step out of the car. Samira could feel the weight of the situation beginning to shift. Something about this officer didn't sit right with her. He was too eager to escalate things, and it felt like he was searching for a reason to cause trouble. She took a deep breath, resisting the urge to challenge him outright. But she was no rookie when it came to encounters like this. Her years of service in the military had prepared her for far worse situations than this. She was trained to think quickly and remain composed under pressure, and she wasn't going to let this officer get away with making assumptions based solely on her appearance. You don't have a reason to pull me out of this vehicle, officer, Samira said, her tone firm but controlled. I haven't broken any laws and I'm not in violation of anything. So, unless you're going to give me a clear legal reason, I'm not stepping out. The officer stared at her for a moment, clearly caught off guard by her calm yet assertive response. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone like her. The street was quiet now, save for the hum of distant cars passing by, and the officer's uncertainty began to show. He glanced back toward his patrol car, his hand hovering near his holster. Samira's eyes followed his movements, noting the tension in his posture. He took another step forward, his tone becoming more insistent. I said, "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Samira remained calm, though her mind was racing. She knew this officer was testing her, trying to provoke a reaction. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a moment to gather herself, her military training kicking in as she remained stone-faced and steady. "Is there any particular reason you're being so aggressive?" she asked, her voice cool and steady. "Are you always this hostile with every driver you pull over, or is it just because I'm black?" The officer's eyes flashed briefly with surprise, but he quickly masked it with a scowl. "I'm just doing my job," he snapped, his voice tight. "I don't appreciate you questioning me." Samira's gaze never wavered. "I'm not questioning you, officer. I'm asking why you're treating me like I'm a criminal when I've done nothing wrong." For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. Samira could feel the officer's eyes on her, scrutinizing her every move, but she stood her ground, not backing down. Finally, Officer Blake's grip on his patient seemed to slip just slightly. He let out a frustrated sigh, his shoulders stiff with unspoken frustration. His tone shifted once more, now laced with thinly veiled hostility. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, ma'am," he muttered. At that, Samira glanced to her side and saw a few people standing by, some with their phones out, watching the interaction unfold. She realized that, though it was just the two of them here, the situation was quickly becoming a public spectacle. There were witnesses, and this would not be a quiet stop. It became clear to Samira that this wasn't about a simple traffic violation. This was something deeper, a reflection of the officer's biases, and she wasn't going to let him use her as a target for his prejudices. "Let me make this clear, officer," Samira said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to argue with you, but I won't stand for being treated unfairly or disrespectfully." The officer didn't respond immediately, his eyes searching her face, trying to find a crack in her composure. But Samira was resolute. There would be no cracks. She had been through far worse than this in her career, and she would not let this man intimidate her. As the silence lingered between them, Samira wondered what his next move would be. Little did she know, the officer's next decision would be a turning point neither of them would ever forget. The air was thick with tension as Samira sat in her car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Officer Blake's steady gaze was fixed on her, his arms crossed in an almost challenging manner. He had yet to back down, and Samira could feel the heat of his hostility radiating in waves. Her mind raced, but she remained perfectly still, reminding herself that this was no ordinary interaction. Her military training had taught her how to handle situations like these, to stay calm and keep a clear head. But even as she drew upon that training, there was an undeniable sense of frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was, being treated as though she were a criminal. And it was clear to her now that Officer Blake wasn't just interested in a routine traffic stop. He had an agenda, one that was driven by his own biases and prejudices. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide your identification," Officer Blake said, his voice dripping with condescension. Samira's lips pressed together in a thin line, but she didn't flinch. "I've already told you that I haven't done anything wrong," she replied calmly, her eyes locking onto his. "So, before I hand over any documents, you need to tell me why I'm being detained." The officer took a step forward, his face hardening. "You're not being detained, ma'am. You're being questioned." His words had a cold edge to them, and Samira could see that he was determined to assert his authority. It was clear that he had no intention of letting this go without a power struggle. She couldn't help but feel that this wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. It was about control. Officer Blake had a need to dominate the situation, and he was looking for any reason to justify his actions. "I'm not handing over my papers until you explain yourself," Samira said, her voice firm and unwavering. The officer's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he seemed to reconsider. But then he took another step closer, his voice now laced with irritation. "What's your problem, ma'am? I'm just doing my job." Samira's gaze sharpened. She could see the underlying hostility in his eyes, the way his posture shifted from professional to aggressive. She could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to choke on. The officer wasn't just questioning her, he was provoking her. And Samira wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. "Doing your job doesn't mean you get to treat people like criminals for no reason," she responded, her voice low but resolute. A brief silence fell between them, but it didn't last long. The officer reached for his radio, seemingly contemplating something. He spoke into it, his voice still tinged with frustration. Samira couldn't make out the words, but she knew it wasn't a simple call for backup. It was a call to escalate things. Whatever game Officer Blake was playing, he had no intention of letting it end here. But just as the officer finished his call, something unexpected happened. From the corner of her eye, Samira noticed a few people gathering on the sidewalk, their phones raised as they began recording the interaction. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't noticed the onlookers before, but now their presence was undeniable. It was almost as if the situation had gone from a simple traffic stop to a public spectacle. The officer seemed to notice the growing crowd as well. His eyes flicked to the bystanders, and Samira could see a flash of annoyance cross his face. It was as though the attention of the public was a challenge to his authority, and he wasn't going to back down now. His posture stiffened, and he turned back to Samira, his voice now more clipped than before. "You think this is a game, don't you?" he sneered. "You think you can stand here and refuse to cooperate without any consequences?" Samira's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward slightly in her seat. "I'm not playing any games, officer. I'm asking you to do your job correctly, and that means explaining why you pulled me over in the first place. It's as simple as that." The officer scoffed, his tone dripping with contempt. "Oh, I'm sure you've got all the answers." "You think you know the law better than I do, don't you?" Samira remained calm, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm not here to argue with you, but I know when I'm being harassed, and that's exactly what this is." The officer's eyes burned with anger at her words, and he seemed to take a step closer to her car. Samira felt the familiar heat of adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she refused to let it control her. She had seen the dangers of reacting impulsively too many times before. The officer was trying to provoke her, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. "You need to step out of the car, ma'am," he said, his voice cold and threatening. Samira shook her head slowly, her expression unmoving. "I've already told you, officer, I'm not stepping out of the car, not until you tell me why you pulled me over." "Don't make me ask you again," he growled, taking another step forward. But Samira held her ground. "I'm not going anywhere until you can explain your actions, and if you continue to try to intimidate me, I'll make sure the entire world knows exactly how you're treating me." She could feel the eyes of the bystanders on her, their phones still recording, capturing every moment of this tense exchange. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated by law enforcement. And she wasn't going to back down. For a long moment, Officer Blake remained silent, his eyes locked onto hers. He was weighing his options, deciding whether to push further or to back off. Samira could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between his sense of authority and the reality that his actions were now being observed by a growing crowd. Finally, he took a step back, his shoulders stiff with frustration. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, ma'am," he muttered, his voice low but still tinged with anger. Samira didn't respond. She simply remained still, her eyes never leaving his. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. But the standoff wasn't over. Not yet. Officer Blake turned on his heel, his hand resting on his radio as he walked back to his patrol car. Samira didn't relax just yet. She knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would force both her and the officer to confront uncomfortable truths. As the crowd murmured behind her, Samira's thoughts swirled with possibilities. She had no idea how this was going to end, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let Officer Blake intimidate her. Not now and not ever. The moment was far from over. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Samira remained seated in her car, every muscle in her body coiled in readiness, her eyes locked on Officer Blake. His presence was oppressive, his condescending words still hanging between them like a thick fog. Despite the officer's refusal to back down, Samira held firm, unwilling to yield to the intimidation. The crowd behind her had grown. A few more bystanders had appeared on the scene, and their murmurs were audible now. Samira could hear the low hum of voices, the occasional camera shutter clicking, and the whispered rumors that were spreading like wildfire. She didn't care. She was no stranger to attention, but this time the stakes were higher. This wasn't just about her. It was about challenging a system that had too often gone unchecked, a system that allowed men like Officer Blake to behave with impunity. The officer seemed to grow more agitated as the seconds passed, his hands twitching near his holster, clearly on edge. Samira remained impassive, her eyes locked on his, but inside, her thoughts were racing. She knew this wasn't just going to end with him walking away in defeat. She had no illusions about the way things worked, but she wouldn't let him push her into submission. The sound of a police cruiser pulling up beside them caught Samira's attention. Officer Blake glanced up, his face twisting into a mix of frustration and surprise. The door of the new patrol car opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his uniform impeccably neat, his stance commanding. It was Captain John Harris, a senior officer Samira recognized immediately. Captain Harris was known in the department for his level-headedness, his ability to diffuse difficult situations, and his reputation for fairness. Samira had heard of him over the years, though their paths had never crossed directly. She didn't know much about his background, but she had heard the stories. He was a man who valued integrity, who had risen through the ranks with respect and discipline. As soon as Captain Harris laid eyes on Samira, the atmosphere shifted. His gaze locked onto her, and for a brief moment, the scene seemed to freeze. It wasn't just the familiarity of her face. It was the realization that Samira was someone he knew, someone who mattered. His expression softened, just a hint, as if recognizing that this situation was more than it appeared. Officer Blake noticed the change in the captain's demeanor and quickly tried to explain himself. "Captain, this woman is acting suspiciously. She's being uncooperative. I've tried to explain the situation to her, but she's refusing to provide her identification or even answer my questions." Samira could hear the frustration in Officer Blake's voice, but she remained silent, watching as Captain Harris took slow, deliberate steps toward them. He didn't make any immediate move to address Blake's accusations. Instead, his eyes never left Samira as he approached her vehicle. The crowd behind her seemed to hold its collective breath, unsure of how this new presence would affect the situation. When Captain Harris reached her car, he paused, his hand resting on the hood, his gaze meeting hers. It was a moment of acknowledgement, of understanding that Samira wasn't just another suspect in a routine stop. He had recognized her for what she was, a woman who demanded respect, who had been unjustly targeted by Officer Blake. "Ma'am," Captain Harris said, his voice calm and steady, "I'm sorry you're being put in this position. I'm Captain Harris. Can you please tell me what's going on here?" Samira took a deep breath, grateful for the shift in tone. She didn't drop her guard, but there was a sense of relief in the air. Captain Harris wasn't like Officer Blake. He wasn't here to escalate the situation or to show off his power. He was here to listen, and that made all the difference. "I was stopped for no reason," Samira explained, her voice steady and composed. "I've asked Officer Blake to explain why I was pulled over, but he hasn't given me a clear answer. Instead, he's been questioning me in a way that feels discriminatory, and I've been asking for some basic respect. I haven't done anything wrong." Captain Harris nodded, his expression neutral but thoughtful. He looked over at Officer Blake, who had taken a step back, clearly uncomfortable under the senior officer's scrutiny. Samira could see the shift in dynamics. Officer Blake was no longer the one in control. His posture had slumped slightly, and his eyes flicked nervously between Samira and the captain. "Officer Blake," Captain Harris said, his tone no longer the commanding presence Samira had heard before. It was firm, but measured. "Explain to me exactly why you decided to stop this vehicle." Officer Blake stammered for a moment, his eyes flicking to Samira before he spoke. "Well, Captain, it's just her behavior. She was driving suspiciously through the neighborhood, and when I pulled her over, she started questioning my authority and refusing to comply." Captain Harris raised an eyebrow. Suspicious driving, what exactly made it suspicious? Were there any signs of erratic behavior, speeding, reckless driving? Blake hesitated, clearly thrown off by the captain's questioning. "No, sir, nothing of that sort, but she just didn't act right. She didn't seem cooperative." Captain Harris's eyes narrowed, and he turned back to Samira. "And what exactly did Officer Blake say to you?" Samira recounted the interaction, her words calm and clear as she described Blake's questions and the condescending tone he had used. She emphasized the officer's refusal to give her a legitimate reason for the stop and his dismissive attitude. Throughout her retelling, Captain Harris remained silent, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that told her he was absorbing every word. When she finished, Captain Harris turned back to Officer Blake, his tone now sharp and authoritative. You understand that a traffic stop needs to be based on a clear, justifiable reason. If there was no lawful basis for stopping this woman, then what you're doing here could be considered harassment. Blake's face turned red as he stammered. But she was acting suspiciously, Captain. She's been difficult from the start. Captain Harris held up a hand, stopping him. Difficult, or is it possible that you were the one who was difficult here? Is it possible that you, Officer Blake, didn't handle this situation professionally? There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Samira could see the conflict in Officer Blake's eyes. He didn't want to back down, but he could feel the pressure mounting. The captain wasn't backing him up. In fact, it was clear that Captain Harris was beginning to doubt his judgment. The senior officer turned back to Samira, his voice gentle but firm. Ma'am, I apologize for the way you've been treated. You're free to go, and Officer Blake will be filing a report on the incident. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you have that right. I'll personally ensure that it's taken seriously. Samira nodded, feeling the weight of the past few minutes lift off her shoulders. For the first time in this encounter, she felt heard, respected. She wasn't just a statistic, a black woman pulled over for no reason. She was a person, and Captain Harris had recognized that. As she reached for her car door, she glanced at Officer Blake one last time. His eyes were downcast, his shoulders slumped. He knew he had lost this round. But as she drove away, Samira knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The fight for justice didn't stop with one encounter. This was merely one battle in a much larger war, and Samira was ready for whatever came next. The quiet hum of the crowd faded into the background as Captain Harris turned his attention back to Officer Blake, his face a study in professionalism. The tension between the two officers was palpable, but it was only when Captain Harris spoke again that the true weight of the situation began to sink in. This, Captain Harris said, his voice calm but firm, is Colonel Samira Johnson, a decorated veteran who has served this country with honor for over 20 years. The words hung in the air, and Samira could feel the shift in the atmosphere as they settled in. The crowd, who had been merely passive observers up until now, began to murmur in surprise. Samira could almost hear their thoughts, the collective realization that they had just witnessed an altercation between a civilian and a highly respected officer, one whose reputation stretched far beyond the confines of her car. Samira glanced at Officer Blake, whose face had gone an ashen shade of white. The officer had opened his mouth in disbelief, but no words came out. He stared at Captain Harris and then back at Samira, his eyes wide with shock. He had clearly not expected this. Who could have? A high-ranking military officer pulled over for no reason other than prejudice. He had misjudged her entirely. Not only had he failed to recognize the woman before him, but he had also placed his own biases ahead of his duty. It was a moment that was difficult for him to process. Samira didn't let the revelation hang in the air for too long, though. She didn't want this moment to be about her. It wasn't about the title, the rank, or the service she had given to her country. It was about something far more important, about the way people treated one another, especially those who didn't have the same privileges or status as others. Samira knew that the true test of character came not from the accolades one had earned, but from how one acted in the face of others' differences. She leaned slightly forward in her seat, looking directly at Officer Blake. Her eyes were steely, unblinking. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet authority. "It's about how you treat people, regardless of their rank or background." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Samira saw a crack in Blake's facade. He stood there, unable to find a response, his gaze fixed on the ground, unable to meet her eyes. For a moment, the pride and arrogance he had carried into the situation seemed to evaporate in front of her. His posture, which had been stiff with authority just moments ago, slumped ever so slightly. "You treated me like I was a criminal," Samira continued, her voice now harder, each word deliberate. "You assumed the worst of me based on nothing more than my skin color. You questioned my right to be on the road to go about my day. You didn't ask. You didn't listen. You judged." The silence that followed was thick, and the stillness of the moment was a stark contrast to the earlier tension. Even Captain Harris, who had been standing off to the side, seemed to be taking a step back, allowing Samira to express herself. He knew that what Samira was saying was not just a personal critique of Officer Blake's behavior, but a fundamental criticism of the system that allowed it to persist. Samira paused, her gaze unwavering as she continued. "And that's the problem, Officer Blake. It's not about me being a colonel or a veteran. It's about you failing to treat me with the basic decency that every human being deserves. It's about you assuming that because I'm black, I'm somehow less deserving of respect or courtesy than someone else. You're supposed to protect and serve. But how are you supposed to protect anyone when you're willing to harm them based on an assumption, a prejudice?" Blake stood there, his hands twitching at his sides, struggling to find an adequate defense. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his tongue seemingly tied by the weight of Samira's words. There was no justification for his actions, no excuse that could erase the blatant disregard for basic human dignity that had been so evident in his conduct. Captain Harris stood off to the side, silently watching as Samira held Blake accountable. He had seen this before. Officers who let their biases cloud their judgment, who let their authority go unchecked. But today was different. Samira was different. She wasn't just another civilian who would let the incident slide. She wasn't the type to passively accept mistreatment. She wasn't interested in being the token exception that proved the rule. Samira turned her focus back to Captain Harris, her expression softening slightly but not losing its firmness. "And you, Captain Harris," she said, her voice still steady but with a hint of gratitude, "you showed what it means to be a leader. You didn't let this slide. You didn't let Officer Blake's behavior go unchallenged. You gave me a voice when I needed it." Captain Harris nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a deep sense of respect. "You're right," he said quietly. "This is not about rank. It's about respect, fairness, and doing what's right, no matter who's involved." Samira's eyes flicked back to Officer Blake. "I'm not asking for anything special. I'm not asking for any extra treatment or favor because of who I am. What I'm asking for is simple. Do your job. Don't let your assumptions, your prejudices, or your personal biases cloud your ability to serve and protect. Learn to treat everyone with the respect they deserve, regardless of their race, their background, or their history." Blake's face remained pale, his eyes downcast as the weight of Samira's words pressed down on him. He had no excuse left. He had been called out not just by Samira, but by his own superior officer, who had made it clear that his actions were unacceptable. There was no defense, no way to argue that he was in the right. His silence spoke volumes. After a few moments of painful quiet, Captain Harris finally broke the tension. "Samira," he said, addressing her directly, "if you'd like to file a complaint, I'll personally ensure that it's handled appropriately. But right now, you're free to go." Samira gave a small, approving nod, her face a picture of calm resolve. "I don't need to file a complaint," she said. "I just need Officer Blake to understand what he did wrong, and I need him to do better in the future." With that, she started her car, the engine humming to life once again. She didn't look back as she slowly drove away, her thoughts already moving beyond the incident. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that things like this didn't continue to happen, that others wouldn't face the same treatment. As Samira disappeared down the road, Captain Harris turned to Officer Blake, his expression hardening once again. "You've been given a second chance, Blake," he said quietly. "Don't waste it." Blake, still standing in the shadow of his failure, nodded meekly. He knew exactly what the captain meant. The lesson had been learned, though it had come at a great cost. The road to redemption would be a long one, and it was a road that Officer Blake would have to walk alone. But Samira had done her part. She had not just fought for herself. She had fought for all those who had been wrongly judged, for all those whose voices had been silenced by the oppressive weight of prejudice. The air remained thick with the weight of the moment, but as Samira sat in her car, preparing to drive away, a wave of clarity washed over her. Officer Blake, now visibly humbled, had muttered an apology under his breath, though it barely broke the tension that still lingered between them. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "I was wrong." Samira glanced over at him one final time, her eyes sharp but not unkind. She had heard his apology, but she knew it wasn't just words that mattered. It was action. It was accountability. Still, she nodded slightly, acknowledging the gesture but made no comment. She was beyond that. Her mission was never about demanding apologies. It was about setting a standard, about showing that the truth would always rise to the surface, even in the most challenging of situations. She shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. As the engine roared to life, the crowd that had gathered to witness the altercation began to break apart. But before she could leave the scene entirely, a spontaneous round of applause erupted from the bystanders. It was soft at first, unsure, but quickly gained momentum. A few claps turned into a dozen, then 100, as people realized what had just transpired. They were clapping not just for Samira's composure, but for her courage in standing up against injustice when others might have stayed silent. They clapped for the message she had sent that day, a message that resonated far beyond this quiet suburban street. Samira kept her eyes ahead as she drove, her hands steady on the wheel. She didn't look in her rearview mirror to see the faces of the people who were now supporting her. She didn't need to. She knew the ripple effect of her actions would be felt far beyond this moment. She had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. The traffic moved slowly, as it often did in suburban areas, but Samira's mind was far from the quiet streets she was navigating. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each moment filled with a quiet sense of resolve. As she turned a corner and headed toward her next destination, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She had nearly forgotten about it, but when she pulled it out, she saw a message from an unknown number. "Thank you for what you did today. You are changing more lives than you realize." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that hit Samira hard. She didn't know who had sent the message, but the sincerity was clear. Whoever it was, they had witnessed the exchange, and they had felt the impact of her actions. It reminded her that sometimes, the most powerful changes happened when no one was looking, when individuals simply stood their ground and did what was right. Samira didn't seek validation, but she appreciated the reminder that her fight wasn't in vain. It wasn't just about her. It was about paving the way for others, those who would follow in her footsteps, even if they didn't have the same platform or opportunity to make a scene. As she continued to drive, her mind wandered back to her own journey, the road that had brought her here. Samira had never sought fame or recognition. She had always believed in the quiet power of doing what was right. Her service to her country, her dedication to her community, her everyday fight against inequality. All of it had shaped her into the person she was today. But she knew that even in the smallest of moments, she had the chance to create something greater than herself. In that simple, momentary exchange with Officer Blake, Samira had reminded everyone that change wasn't just about words, it was about actions. It was about the courage to challenge the status quo, even when it wasn't easy. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a flood of notifications, messages, texts, and even social media alerts. The footage of the confrontation had gone viral. People across the country were watching, and the story was spreading fast. The message was clear. Samira's stand was not just a personal victory, but a victory for anyone who had ever felt underestimated, marginalized, or silenced. As Samira reflected on her actions, she realized something fundamental. This wasn't about titles or recognition. It wasn't about her own journey of achievement or the accolades she had earned. It was about paving a better path for those who would come after her, those who would fight their own battles and perhaps find strength in her example. Her actions had been a quiet declaration that everyone, regardless of their background, deserved the same respect, the same opportunities, and the same protection under the law. In the grand scheme of things, one moment like this might seem small, but Samira understood that these moments were the building blocks of change. It wasn't about monumental speeches or large-scale movements. It was about everyday actions that spoke louder than words ever could. It was about people like her, standing firm, making sure that justice was served, not just for themselves, but for everyone. She turned another corner, her car gliding smoothly along the road. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. Samira didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. She had made a difference today. And that difference, however small, would last long after the applause faded. She could hear it now, in the quiet of her car, in the hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of the road beneath her tires. A message clearer than any applause or text message. True change starts with one person. And Samira Johnson, with her unwavering resolve, had taken the first step.